Mrs. Gable smirked, watching the children toil. "You'll never tell your father," she sneered. Arthur, returning early, saw the scene. What he uttered next froze her smile forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur returned unexpectedly early from a critical overseas conference, the kind that usually demanded his full, unwavering attention for weeks on end. His private jet had sliced through the clouds, landing hours ahead of schedule, a rare occurrence that filled him with an unexpected surge of anticipation to see his children. The sprawling, opulent mansion, usually a beacon of quiet activity, was eerily silent as he stepped through the grand oak doors. The usual hum of domesticity, the faint murmur of Mrs. Gable's presence, the distant echo of a child's laugh, or even a playful whine, all were replaced by an unsettling stillness that immediately pricked at his senses, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of his own life as a highly successful entrepreneur. He had built an empire from the ground up, a testament to his sharp intellect and relentless drive. But the silence of his home now felt heavier than any corporate silence he had ever encountered, a chilling premonition whispering through the grand, empty halls. His polished shoes clicked softly on the marble floor as he moved deeper into the house, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Hello? Mrs. Gable? Lily? Leo?" No answer came, only the hollow reverberation of his own words. His heart, usually so steady, began to beat with an unaccustomed rhythm of dread. He found himself drawn towards the back of the house, where the children's playroom was situated, a space usually vibrant with toys and childish energy. As he approached, a faint, muffled sound reached him, a whimpering that was barely audible but unmistakable. It was the sound of his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and it was laced with a raw, desperate fear that sent a jolt of icy terror through his veins. He quickened his pace, his earlier fatigue completely forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He pushed open the playroom door, not gently, but with a force born of sudden, overwhelming panic. The scene that greeted him was a tableau of quiet horror that would forever be etched into the deepest corners of his memory. Lily, her small frame trembling, was hunched in a corner, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her usually bright eyes wide with terror. Beside her, his infant son, Leo, lay in his playpen, his tiny face flushed, and his small fists clenched. A soft, intermittent cry escaping his lips, a sound of profound distress. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper he had entrusted with the very core of his world, stood over them, her back to Arthur, her posture rigid, and her voice a low, menacing hiss. She held a feather duster, not in a cleaning gesture, but pointed menacingly towards Lily, her shadow looming large and distorted on the wall, a grotesque silhouette of power and cruelty. "You will clean every single one of these toys, and you will do it now." Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the air, devoid of the warmth and nurturing tone she usually adopted in his presence. "And if you make one more sound, your baby brother won't get his nap." Lily looked up at her father, her eyes widening even further, a silent plea passing between them, a desperate cry for rescue that tore at Arthur's very soul. "Daddy," Lily whimpered, her voice barely a whisper, a broken sound that fractured the last vestiges of Arthur's composure. "Please, Daddy, make her stop. Protect us." The words, simple yet profoundly heartbreaking, were a dagger to his heart, exposing the gaping wound of his perceived absence and the insidious evil that had festered in his home. Arthur felt a primal roar building in his chest, a fury he had never known, a protectiveness so fierce it threatened to consume him whole. His successful life, his vast wealth, his towering achievements, all suddenly felt meaningless, hollow, in the face of his daughter's terror. He had been so consumed by the relentless pursuit of his business, so lost in the fog of his grief after his beloved wife's untimely departure during Leo's birth, that he had allowed this insidious darkness to creep into the very sanctuary of his family. He had been a ghost in his own opulent home, a provider of material comfort, but an absentee father in the most crucial emotional sense. The sight of Mrs. Gable, her face now turning to him, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by a forced, sickly sweet smile, only fueled his rage. But beneath the anger, a searing wave of guilt washed over him, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. He had failed them, utterly and completely, and the chilling realization threatened to break him. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that his life and the lives of his precious children would never be the same again. This was merely the beginning of a battle for their very souls, a fight he had unknowingly been preparing for his entire life. Arthur's voice, when it finally emerged, was not the roar he felt building, but a low, dangerous growl, laced with a cold authority that had made countless business adversaries tremble. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his eyes fixed on her, not on the duster, but on the chilling absence of warmth in her forced smile. "Step away from my children." The command hung heavy in the air, stripping away the veneer of her composure. Her smile faltered, her shoulders stiffening imperceptibly, a fleeting spark of something dark flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a practiced subservience. She lowered the duster, her movements stiff, and turned fully towards him, her hands clasped meekly in front of her, a picture of feigned innocence. "Mr. Arthur, you're back so soon. What a lovely surprise. The children were just helping me with the tidying up, weren't you, dears?" She cooed, her voice saccharine sweet, a stark contrast to the harsh tone Lily had just heard. Lily, however, only burrowed deeper into the corner, her small body still trembling, her eyes never leaving her father's face, searching for safety. Arthur ignored Mrs. Gable's false pleasantries, his gaze sweeping over his daughter's tear-streaked face, then to his son, Leo, who still whimpered softly in his playpen. He knelt, his expensive suit forgotten, and gathered Lily into his arms, feeling the fragile tremor of her small frame against his chest. Her tiny arms wrapped around his neck, holding him with a desperate strength that pierced his heart anew. The scent of her childhood, mingled with the faint smell of dust and tears, filled him with a profound sense of failure and a fierce, burgeoning resolve. He had always been a man of action, a titan in the world of finance, but in the quiet, sacred space of his home, he had been tragically passive, allowing his immense grief to create a chasm between himself and the very beings he was meant to cherish above all else. His beloved wife, Clara, a woman of radiant warmth and boundless love, had departed during Leo's birth, leaving behind a void that Arthur had tried to fill with an obsessive pursuit of work, believing that providing material security was enough. He now understood, with a sickening clarity, that he had been terribly, unforgivably wrong. Beatrice Gable, a woman in her late 50s, had presented herself as the epitome of a caring caregiver when she was hired months ago, her references impeccable, her demeanor outwardly solicitous. She spoke often of her own lost family, weaving tales of quiet hardship that had touched Arthur's weary, grieving heart, making her seem like a safe, empathetic presence for his motherless children. Yet, beneath that carefully constructed facade lay a chilling darkness, a manipulative mind fueled by a potent cocktail of resentments and desires. She had watched Arthur's emotional distance grow, his retreat into his work a gaping wound she had expertly exploited. She saw not a grieving father, but a vulnerable, wealthy Mark, a man whose fortune could be siphoned, whose children could be controlled, whose life could be subtly twisted to serve her own bitter ends. Her motivations were a complex tapestry of greed, a deep-seated envy for the life Arthur possessed, and a twisted sense of retribution for her own perceived misfortunes, believing perhaps that by inflicting suffering, she was leveling some cosmic score. Over the following days, Arthur watched, his senses now acutely tuned to every nuance, every subtle shift in the household. He observed Mrs. Gable's alternating nature. One moment, she was the picture of a doting housekeeper, fussing over Lily's meals, gently rocking Leo, her voice soft and reassuring. The next, a shadow would cross her face, a tightening of her lips, a coldness in her eyes when she thought Arthur was preoccupied with his calls or paperwork. He started noticing things he had previously dismissed as childish clumsiness or normal infant fussiness. A faint, purplish bruise on Lily's arm, which Mrs. Gable had explained away as a fall during play. Leo's sudden, inconsolable crying spells when Mrs. Gable was alone with him, which ceased almost instantly upon Arthur's entrance. The children's playroom door, sometimes found mysteriously locked from the outside when Arthur returned home unexpectedly. A quick excuse about ensuring their safety from drafts or intruders always ready on Mrs. Gable's lips. His guilt, a heavy cloak upon his shoulders, spurred him into action. He began to subtly investigate, his sharp mind, usually reserved for complex business deals, now entirely focused on uncovering the truth lurking within his own home. He started spending more time at home, canceling non-essential meetings, his presence a silent, unsettling disruptor to Mrs. Gable's carefully orchestrated reign. He searched for clues, for anything that might shed light on the unsettling reality. One evening, while sifting through old photographs of Clara, a painful but necessary ritual, he stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in her nightstand drawer. It was Clara's, filled with her elegant handwriting, a chronicle of her thoughts and dreams, and near the end, a poignant letter she had started writing to him, meant to be discovered only after Leo's birth. The words were a gentle whisper from the past, a guide from the woman who had known him best, urging him to always protect their children, to trust his instincts, and reminding him of the profound, unconditional love that bound their family together. It was in those pages, amidst the expressions of her enduring love, that Arthur found not only solace, but a renewed sense of purpose, a silent promise to his departed wife that he would never again fail their precious children. This letter, a beacon of Clara's foresight and love, became his silent companion, pushing him deeper into the insidious web of deceit woven by Mrs. Gable. Arthur's presence in the mansion became a quiet storm, an unspoken challenge to Mrs. Gable's carefully constructed dominion. He moved through the opulent rooms with a new, deliberate purpose, his eyes missing nothing, his ears acutely tuned to every whisper, every muffled cry. He canceled his most demanding engagements, delegating tasks he once considered irreplaceable, his empire now managed from a distance, allowing him to be physically present in a way he hadn't been since Clara's departure. Mrs. Gable, initially attempting to maintain her saccharine facade, found her composure fraying under his unwavering scrutiny. Her movements grew stiffer, her forced smiles less convincing, a subtle tremor sometimes betraying her carefully cultivated calm when Arthur unexpectedly appeared in a doorway, his gaze piercing through her practiced innocence. He noticed the way she would sometimes pause, her hand hovering over Lily's arm, a flash of something cold in her eyes, before she would remember herself and offer a soft, almost too sweet word, a performance designed for his benefit. The subtle signs of distress in his children, once easily dismissed by his grief-clouded mind, now screamed for his attention. Lily, who had always loved her afternoon snacks, now picked at her food, often pushing away her plate with a quiet sigh when Mrs. Gable was serving, only to eat heartily when Arthur personally offered her a piece of fruit. Leo, his infant son, would sometimes flinch at Mrs. Gable's sudden movements, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor passing through his small body, a stark contrast to the way he would reach out with open arms for Arthur, his face lighting up with an innocent joy that tore at his father's heart. One evening, Arthur pretended to be engrossed in a late-night report, his office door ajar, while listening intently to the sounds of the house. He heard Mrs. Gable's voice, low and sharp, coming from Lily's room, not the gentle lullaby she sang when Arthur was near, but a clipped, impatient tone, followed by Lily's soft whimper, quickly stifled. The next morning, Lily's eyes held a weary sadness, a shadow that no child of 6 should carry, and Arthur's resolve solidified, hardening into a steel wall of determination. He began to set traps, subtle tests that Mrs. Gable, in her arrogance, unwittingly walked into. He would leave a toy in a specific spot, only to find it roughly tossed aside later, despite Mrs. Gable's insistence that Lily had been careless. He installed discreet cameras, cleverly disguised as part of the mansion's smart home system, focusing on the children's main play areas, not to spy on them, but to observe the interactions when he was not physically present. The footage, viewed in the quiet solitude of his study late at night, was damning, a chilling confirmation of his darkest fears. It showed Mrs. Gable's true nature, the harsh tug on Lily's arm, the way she would ignore Leo's cries for extended periods, allowing him to become distressed before finally attending to him with a forced, resentful air, and the menacing whispers she delivered to Lily, her face contorted into a mask of cold displeasure when she thought no one was watching. He saw Lily's small shoulders slump, her spirit slowly dimming under the weight of this unseen cruelty. The letter from Clara, her elegant script a ghostly comfort, became Arthur's constant companion, its words echoing in his mind, urging him to be strong, to protect their precious legacy. He started spending every possible moment with Lily and Leo, not just observing, but actively engaging. He would read Lily stories, his voice soft and reassuring, holding her close as she slowly, tentatively, began to unburden herself, not with explicit words of abuse, but with fragmented tales of Mrs. Gable's rules and bad dreams that painted a terrifying picture. He would spend hours on the floor with Leo, coaxing smiles from his infant son, rediscovering the pure, unadulterated joy of fatherhood that his grief had stolen from him. The children, initially wary, slowly blossomed under his unwavering attention, their laughter once again echoing through the halls, a fragile melody of healing that slowly began to drown out the lingering shadows of fear. This reconnection was not just for them. It was for him, too, a balm for his wounded soul, a rediscovery of the love that had always been there, merely buried under layers of pain and neglect. His investigation extended beyond the hidden cameras. Arthur, leveraging his extensive network, began a discreet, deep dive into Mrs. Gable's background. The impeccable references she had provided during her hiring suddenly seemed too perfect, too polished. He discovered discrepancies, small but significant gaps in her employment history, and a pattern of abruptly leaving previous positions. A former employer, when finally located and persuaded to speak off the record, recounted a story of missing valuables and suspicious financial irregularities, hinting at a darker side to Mrs. Gable's seemingly humble persona. It became clear that her motivations were not merely born of a twisted sense of justice or resentment, but deeply rooted in a calculated, insidious greed. There were whispers of a modest inheritance from a distant relative that had mysteriously vanished, and a trail of unpaid debts that suggested a desperate financial situation. Arthur realized Mrs. Gable wasn't just manipulating his children. She was systematically siphoning funds, subtly diverting small amounts from household accounts, perhaps even planning a more significant financial maneuver, using his grief and trust as her ultimate weapon. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The extent of her betrayal far exceeding his initial imaginings. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield, and Arthur was ready to fight for his children, armed with truth and an unyielding, rediscovered love. Arthur's nights became a vigil, a silent watch over his shattered home. He moved with a quiet stealth, his senses heightened, his every nerve attuned to the subtle rhythms of the mansion after dark. The hidden cameras, cleverly integrated into the decor, captured more than just Mrs. Gable's overt cruelties. They revealed her insidious financial machinations, a web woven with meticulous deceit. He witnessed her late-night excursions into his study, her careful perusal of his desk, her nimble fingers sifting through documents, always replacing them with an almost unnerving precision. One particular night, the footage showed her with a small, leather-bound book, one of Clara's cherished journals, not the one Arthur had found, but an earlier volume filled with personal financial notes and the details of a small trust Clara had established for the children, a nest egg for their future education. Mrs. Gable's eyes, usually so calculating, held a glint of triumph as she photographed certain pages with her discreet phone, a clear indication that her avarice extended far beyond petty siphoning, reaching into the very heart of his children's inheritance, a brazen attempt to manipulate their financial security. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate double-cross, a violation of the sacred trust he had placed in her. The next morning, a subtle tension hung in the air, a silent battle of wills playing out beneath the veneer of domestic routine. Arthur, armed with his newfound knowledge, observed Mrs. Gable with a chilling calmness. He noticed her furtive glances towards his study, her slightly too eager offers to help him organize his papers, attempts to gauge how much he knew, or if he suspected anything. He decided to test her, leaving a seemingly innocuous document, a draft of a minor investment portfolio, slightly askew on his desk, a hidden camera meticulously focused on it. By morning, it had been subtly realigned, a clear sign of her nocturnal trespass. The proof accumulated, piece by damning piece, painting a portrait of a woman driven by a corrosive blend of greed and a bitter, twisted sense of entitlement, believing perhaps that Arthur's wealth was her due, a compensation for her own perceived misfortunes. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about control, about inflicting a perverse form of justice on a man she saw as undeserving. His reconnections with Lily and Leo deepened, becoming the anchor in his storm-tossed world. Lily, sensing her father's unwavering presence, began to open up in quiet, fragmented ways. During their nightly ritual of reading bedtime stories, nestled safely in his arms, she would sometimes whisper about the bad lady's rules, not directly naming Mrs. Gable, but describing the coldness, the demands for absolute silence, the fear of making a mistake. She spoke of how Mrs. Gable would sometimes take away her favorite toys for no reason, or make her sit in the dark closet, not as a punishment for misbehavior, but as a twisted exercise of control. Arthur listened, his heart aching with every revelation, every innocent word, a fresh wound, but also a renewed surge of protective fury. He found himself rediscovering the simple, profound joy of fatherhood he had lost in the haze of his grief. He would spend hours with Leo, tickling his tiny feet, making silly faces, eliciting pure, unadulterated infant laughter that filled the mansion with a warmth it had sorely lacked. He saw the children blossoming, their eyes regaining a spark, their small bodies relaxing in his presence, a testament to the healing power of unwavering love and attention. The casual conversations he initiated with Mrs. Gable became subtle interrogations, veiled challenges to her carefully constructed reality. He would mention hypothetical scenarios. "I heard a strange noise last night, Mrs. Gable. Did you happen to hear anything?" Or, "I was reviewing some of Clara's old papers. Fascinating how she kept track of everything, wasn't it?" Each question, seemingly innocent, was a carefully placed stone in the path of her deceit, watching for her reaction. The flicker of discomfort in her eyes, the slight tightening of her smile. She grew increasingly agitated, her demeanor shifting from subservience to a barely concealed resentment, a fragile mask cracking under the pressure of his relentless, quiet scrutiny. She would make excuses to be out of the house, spending longer hours on errands, attempting to escape the palpable tension, the feeling of being watched, of her carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. One evening, Arthur confronted her directly, not with accusations, but with an unsettling calm that was far more potent. He held up a copy of Clara's trust document, the one Mrs. Gable had photographed, and simply said, "I found this tucked away. It seems Clara had a remarkable foresight for the children's future. It's comforting to know everything is in order, isn't it, Mrs. Gable?" Her face, usually so composed, paled noticeably, a tremor passing through her hands as she clutched a tea towel. She stammered a response, something about Clara being a wonderful woman, but her eyes betrayed her, darting nervously, a cornered animal trapped in a luxurious cage. The confrontation was subtle, yet devastating, a silent declaration of war, without a single raised voice. Arthur knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had her. The truth, like a relentless tide, was slowly but surely washing away the foundations of her deceit, and the stage was being set for a final, decisive reckoning, not just for justice, but for the full, complete reclamation of his children's innocence and his family's peace. Mrs. Gable's carefully constructed world, once so stable and predictable, now felt like a house of cards buffeted by an invisible storm. Arthur's quiet scrutiny, the relentless wind threatening to topple it all. The subtle confrontation about Clara's trust had stripped away the last vestiges of her feigned innocence, leaving her raw and exposed. Her movements became jerky, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent rooms, always searching for Arthur, always wondering if he was watching, if he knew more than he let on. The saccharine sweetness in her voice curdled into an almost imperceptible bitterness when she spoke to the children, especially when Arthur's back was turned, her patience worn thin by the constant pressure. She tried to regain a sense of control, often attempting to isolate Lily and Leo from their father, inventing errands or suggesting quiet activities in remote parts of the house. But Arthur's omnipresence, his sudden appearances, thwarted her every attempt, a silent, unyielding guardian shadow. One afternoon, Arthur observed her from the hidden camera in the kitchen. Lily, her small hands struggling with a complex puzzle, had accidentally spilled a glass of juice. Mrs. Gable, her face contorted in a mask of pure exasperation, grabbed the girl's arm with a harshness that made Arthur's blood run cold, whispering, "You clumsy, useless child. Do you know how much trouble you cause? Your father will be so disappointed in you, just like he always is." Lily's tiny shoulders slumped, her eyes filling with tears, a silent testament to the emotional abuse she had endured, believing her father's love was conditional, easily lost. Arthur watched, his heart a stone in his chest, the raw evidence cementing his resolve. He understood then that Mrs. Gable's cruelty was not merely born of greed, but of a deep-seated desire to inflict pain, to break the spirits of these innocent children, perhaps to mirror her own unspoken suffering. He felt a profound sorrow for Lily, for the way her innocent joy had been systematically chipped away, but also a fierce pride in her resilience, in her quiet strength. The children, sensing the shift in the household's atmosphere, the palpable tension between their father and Mrs. Gable, began to find solace and courage in Arthur's unwavering presence. Lily, during their evening story time, would trace patterns on her father's hand, her voice barely a whisper, sharing fragments of her day. Not direct accusations, but veiled descriptions of Mrs. Gable's mean games, of being made to sit in the dark, of being told she was bad for crying. She described how Mrs. Gable would sometimes throw away her drawings, saying they were messy, or would tell her that her mother, Clara, wouldn't be proud of her. Each innocent revelation was a fresh wound to Arthur's soul, but also a powerful catalyst, strengthening his resolve to protect them at all costs. He would hold her tighter, his words a balm, assuring her of his unconditional love, reminding her of Clara's boundless affection, slowly rebuilding the shattered fragments of her self-worth. Leo, though too young to speak, communicated his distress in his own way. He would often cry inconsolably when Mrs. Gable was near, his small body stiffening, his face turning red with unexplained fear, only to calm almost instantly when Arthur scooped him into his arms, burying his face in his father's chest. A silent plea for protection. Arthur noticed the small, almost imperceptible flinches, the way Leo would turn his head away from Mrs. Gable's touch, movements that spoke volumes to a father now acutely attuned to his children's every nuance. He spent countless hours simply being with them, playing on the floor with Leo, letting Lily help him with trivial tasks, filling their days with laughter and gentle reassurance, slowly but surely eroding the fear that had become a constant companion in their lives. The mansion, once a gilded cage of grief and neglect, slowly transformed into a haven of rediscovered love and warmth, its grand rooms echoing not with silence, but with the precious sounds of childhood. Arthur, with the cold precision of a seasoned strategist, began to consolidate his evidence. He meticulously reviewed all the hidden camera footage, creating a damning timeline of Mrs. Gable's abuse, her financial manipulations, and her insidious attempts to undermine his children's emotional well-being. He cross-referenced the financial discrepancies he had unearthed with the dates and times of her nocturnal visits to his study, creating an undeniable paper trail of her avarice. He even found a small hidden compartment in Mrs. Gable's personal effects, a discovery made during a discreet search, while she was out on one of her increasingly frequent, lengthy errands. Inside, he found a collection of his wife's personal trinkets, a delicate silver locket Clara had always worn, a small, handwritten poem from Arthur to Clara, and a lock of Clara's hair, items of immense sentimental value that had mysteriously vanished after her departure. This final discovery was not about money, but about a perverse, twisted obsession, a violation of the most sacred memories, and it solidified Arthur's understanding of the depth of Mrs. Gable's malicious intent. The atmosphere in the mansion became thick with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills playing out beneath the surface of everyday life. Mrs. Gable, sensing the net closing in, grew increasingly erratic, her carefully cultivated composure completely shattered. She would occasionally lash out with sharp words, quickly retracting them with forced apologies, her eyes betraying a desperate fear, a cornered animal preparing for a final, futile stand. Arthur, however, remained calm, his resolve unshakable, his every action guided by the fierce, protective love he felt for his children. He knew the time for subtlety was over, that the truth, like a powerful current, was about to break through, and that justice, though delayed, would finally be served. The pieces were all in place, the evidence undeniable, and Arthur, no longer a grieving ghost but a fierce protector, was ready to reclaim his family's peace and usher in a new dawn of hope and healing. The time for quiet observation and subtle maneuvering had passed. Arthur, his heart heavy but resolute, knew he could no longer allow Mrs. Gable's insidious presence to poison his home. The evidence he had meticulously gathered, a chilling tapestry of abuse and avarice, demanded immediate, decisive action. He contacted his trusted legal team, outlining the situation with a cold, almost detached precision that belied the storm raging within him. providing them with the full extent of his findings: the hidden camera footage, the financial records detailing the subtle siphoning of funds, the copies of Clara's manipulated trust documents, and the heartbreaking discovery of his wife's stolen personal effects, each item a silent scream of betrayal. His lawyers, usually accustomed to corporate battles, were moved by the raw vulnerability in his voice, the fierce paternal love now shining through the veneer of the business magnate. They assured him that the case was strong, the proof undeniable, and that justice, though sometimes slow, would ultimately prevail. The day of reckoning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky, mirroring the somber mood that settled over the grand mansion. Arthur had arranged for the authorities to arrive discreetly, wanting to spare Lily and Leo any unnecessary trauma, but he knew the confrontation was inevitable. Mrs. Gable, still attempting to project an air of injured innocence, hovered in the background, her eyes darting between Arthur and the newly arrived figures in uniform, a desperate fear beginning to etch itself onto her face. Arthur, holding Lily's small hand firmly in his, while Leo slept peacefully in a baby carrier strapped to his chest, felt a surge of strength. He looked at his children, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the darkness he was about to expose, and knew this was not just for them, but for every child who had ever suffered in silence. He led the officers and his legal counsel into the expansive living room, a space usually reserved for quiet contemplation or elegant gatherings, now transformed into an arena of truth. Arthur calmly presented his case, his voice steady, devoid of the anger he felt, focusing on the facts. He projected the hidden camera footage onto the large screen, a silent, damning narrative unfolding before their eyes. The images showed Mrs. Gable's harsh words, her rough handling of Lily, the agonizing moments of neglect inflicted upon Leo, the calculated manipulation of household accounts, and the chilling late-night intrusions into his study, culminating in the photographic evidence of Clara's trust documents. Each clip, each still image, was a hammer blow to Mrs. Gable's facade. Lily, nestled against her father's side, watched with wide, solemn eyes, occasionally flinching at the sight of Mrs. Gable's cruel expressions on screen, instinctively tightening her grip on Arthur's hand. He felt her small body tremble, and he squeezed her hand reassuringly, a silent promise of protection passing between them. The weight of the evidence became unbearable for Mrs. Gable. Her carefully constructed composure finally shattered, cracking under the relentless pressure of undeniable truth. She began to pace, her movements agitated, her eyes wild, her voice rising from a defensive stammer to a raw, guttural outburst. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you, Mr. Arthur?" she shrieked, her true nature finally erupting, a torrent of bitterness and resentment. "With your money, your perfect life, your beautiful wife who just left you with these burdens. You were never here. You never saw. I was the one who was always here, cleaning up your messes, dealing with your spoiled children. I deserved more. You all deserve to feel what it's like to be ignored, to be unwanted." Her words, laced with venom and a twisted sense of self-pity, hung in the air, revealing a soul consumed by envy and a perverse desire for revenge against a world she felt had wronged her. She confessed to feeling entitled to Arthur's wealth, believing her own misfortunes had granted her a right to take from him, to make his children suffer, as she believed she had suffered in her own life, a chilling justification for her cruelty. Lily, hearing these terrifying words, buried her face in Arthur's chest, her small body shaking with fear and a profound sadness. The innocent understanding of Mrs. Gable's malice, now starkly clear. Leo, stirred by the sudden commotion, began to whimper softly in his carrier, his tiny hand reaching blindly for his father's face. Arthur held them both tighter, his heart aching with a renewed sense of protective love, a silent vow that no harm would ever touch them again. The officers, witnessing Mrs. Gable's complete unraveling, moved forward, their faces grim, their duty clear. Betrotzes. Gable resisted, her screams echoing through the grand halls, but her outburst, far from helping her, only served as a final, undeniable confession, a stark revelation of the darkness she harbored within. The confrontation, though emotionally wrenching, brought a strange, cleansing clarity, a painful but necessary extraction of the poison that had infiltrated their lives. As the officers led Mrs. Gable away, her cries fading into the distance, a profound silence descended upon the mansion, not the unsettling quiet of neglect, but the quiet of a storm finally passing, leaving behind a fragile, hopeful calm. Arthur looked down at his children, their eyes slowly meeting his, and knew that the long, arduous journey of healing had just truly begun. 2 years later, the grand mansion, once shadowed by grief and fear, now vibrated with a palpable warmth, a symphony of laughter and contentment. Arthur, no longer a ghost haunting his own opulent home, had fully embraced his role as a father, his heart brimming with a love he once thought irrevocably lost. He spent his mornings in the sprawling gardens with Lily, teaching her the names of flowers, their hands covered in rich earth as they planted vibrant petunias and fragrant roses, symbols of new beginnings. Lily, now a bright, confident 8-year-old, chattered happily, her eyes sparkling with an unburdened joy, her small hand fitting perfectly into her father's larger one. The fear that had once clouded her gaze had completely vanished, replaced by a radiant trust. Leo, a boisterous and curious 2-year-old, chased butterflies across the manicured lawn, his infectious giggles echoing through the air, a sound Arthur cherished more than any business deal. Mealtimes, once silent and somber, were now lively affairs, filled with animated conversations and the clinking of cutlery, a true family feast. Arthur would listen intently as Lily recounted her school-day adventures, or patiently guide Leo's tiny fork, his gaze always soft, always present. He had learned to live in the moment, to savor every precious second with his children, understanding that true wealth lay not in his vast fortune, but in the unbreakable bonds of love he shared with them. The mansion, once a monument to his sorrow, had been transformed into a vibrant sanctuary, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of unconditional affection. The journey had been arduous, marked by painful revelations and the slow, deliberate work of healing, but Arthur had emerged stronger, a man redefined by love and purpose. He saw now that Clara's final, silent message, the very essence of her enduring spirit, had been to protect their children, and in doing so, he had found his own redemption. Justice had been served, Mrs. Gable's manipulations exposed and punished, but the true victory was the restoration of his family's peace, the rekindling of joy in his children's eyes. The truth, courageously faced, had paved the way for a future filled with hope, proving that even from the deepest despair, love, fierce and unwavering, possesses the power to mend broken hearts and protect the innocent, transforming a house into a home once more. What would you sacrifice to shield innocence from a hidden evil and reclaim a love you thought was lost forever? Share your thoughts and stories, for in every act of protection, in every embrace of truth, we build a world where love always triumphs. Remember, the true strength of a family lies in its unwavering presence, its unconditional love, and its courage to stand against any darkness.